Week or two since Apple announced um, their switch to macOS Big Sur. This is officially macOS version 11. It is the end of an era. I mentioned that in my prior video when I put my thoughts out about WWDC, but I wanted to go more in depth on what I thought of macOS 11. And what ended up happening was I took a bit of a stroll down memory lane because I've been through macOS 10's entire existence. Started way back in high school for me. Starting with macOS 10 Jaguar. And when I first laid eyes on this interface that you now see before you, and for those of you who cannot see, you've got basically an aqua blue interface, a lot of drop shadows, a lot of bubbly effects, visually speaking. This was a real turning point at the time for macOS 10. For macOS in general, macOS 10 was a brand new user interface for the entire system, for the entire macOS system throughout its history. And if you Google macOS 10 introduction, you can see Steve first introducing it. I didn't use Cheetah or Puma. My very first introduction was OS 10 Jaguar. And I loved it. I loved Jaguar. I loved the look. I loved the way it felt. But I also loved the hardware that it ran on. Our class was outfitted with a whole room of these. And for those of you who cannot see, what's in front of me is the Apple eMac. And for those of you who do not know, the Apple eMac was sort of a spiritual successor to the original iMac, specifically aimed at the education market. I don't care who you are, but as far as I'm concerned, there is no design that will ever top this. There was no design that will ever top this. And would I like to have an eMac in my collection? Certainly. The only problem is I don't trust myself to work on CRTs, so I'd have to have something that is completely intact. And also, the system was discontinued in 2005, so it's been 15 years. So I don't know how much use it would get today, but it would be an interesting trip down memory lane if I could find one. Whether I will, I don't know. But I just love these little things. They were a 15-inch all-in-one. You had the speakers below the display and the CD-ROM in between them, in between the speakers. All the ports were on the right-hand side. And it was just amazing. I loved, like I said, the overall look. I loved how it handled. In the upper right-hand corner, there was a number here, and I believe I was normally on number 25. But no, the overall way it behaved, the overall way it handled was just fantastic for me, especially because starting with OS 10 Panther, I was able to gain access to full screen magnification. Now that really opened doors for me because at the time my vision was considerably worse, and we have full screen magnification now in both Mac and Windows. But at the time, when it came to Panther, and I think it might have been in Jaguar, I don't remember, but it was definitely in Panther. And when I remember seeing that, Windows XP didn't have anything close to it. In fact, we'd have to wait until after I graduated high school to have something like that on Windows. So, so the Mac for me really was a way to expand my horizons. Now, one thing to note is that I had an individualized education plan. And for those of you who are not from the United States, it stands for Individualized Education Plan, IEP. It basically means that I get special accommodations as a student with a vision impairment. And for those of you who have been longtime viewers, you're probably thinking, well, wait a moment, didn't he do already a video on this? Yes, I did, but it's been 8 years, and I figured I'd do it again because we genuinely are at the end of an era now that we have macOS 11 on the horizon. But so, my IEP required me to have extra time on tasks. And in order to complete that, I had to buy a Mac. And that is because the software we used, Final Cut Pro and iMovie specifically, were Mac exclusives. Adobe Illustrator and Adobe Photoshop and Adobe InDesign, those were available on Windows. But because we were using iMovie, because we were using Final Cut Pro especially, we absolutely had to have a Mac. So at that point, we went ahead and got this. This is the iMac G4. Ours was the 17-inch. It came with Jaguar, upgraded to Panther, and it became my daily driver. Now, a lot of people call this thing the iLamp. I call it the Dome. And the reason I call it the Dome is because, for those of you who cannot see, there's a 17-inch LCD screen that is mounted on a post. And that post allows you to maneuver the screen. You can bring it closer to you. You can move it around. The current generation iMac has something similar, but it's not, in my opinion, it's not as robust, and you end up taking the whole computer with you when you move the screen around, which means if you're not careful, you know, cables and stuff. Whereas with this design, you had the display and the computer itself as separate units. The cables were around back, always in the same place. They never moved. You didn't have to worry about putting strain on anything. You didn't have to worry about breaking anything. Rumor has it there's going to be a brand new iMac coming out, and I'm hoping they do something like this. I'm hoping they bring back, if not the Dome, then something very similar. I still have my Dome, I think. It's either out in storage here at my home, or we gave it away, but I don't remember. My only concern is that if it is still in storage, it might no longer be working. The battery may have exploded, and that's because where we stored it is not in a ventilated area, and I live in a very hot climate. And it's been sitting out there, if it is still out there, it's been sitting out there for years and years. So I don't think it's going to be, if I brought it back out to try and hook it back up, I'd be very surprised if it powered on. Even if it did, I don't remember the password. Yay. But no, so that was macOS 10 Jaguar and Panther, eMac and iMac G4. Both of those were honestly my favorite Macintoshes because they were the genesis for me in terms of being a Mac user up until this day. I think that of the two, I have greater appreciation for the eMac because those things are a lot rarer. They were never available. Well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say never. They were shortly available to the consumer market, but they didn't last very long. They didn't last even a decade compared to the iMac that has undergone several iterations, but overall as a product has been lasting for over 20 years. So I graduated high school, and for high school I got a Sony Vaio Windows XP computer, and I found out very shortly after starting college that the battery in that thing was not going to work, and I didn't feel like lugging the adapter, because back in those days, your adapter for a PC was a great big power brick that weighed in itself about 2 pounds, and having to lug all this in my backpack, not happening. So I arranged to get a new computer, and I'll get to that in a moment, but that new computer came with a macOS 10 Tiger. macOS 10 Tiger was the introduction to all of us in the blind community for VoiceOver. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't really use VoiceOver all that much because I primarily used the magnifier, but at the same time, it was really nice to have a built-in screen reader, not just built-in in terms of being preloaded, but literally built into the core of the operating system. At that time, on Windows, you had Narrator, but compared to VoiceOver, it was not very usable. And Windows obviously had issues with crashing, and because OS X and VoiceOver were essentially one and the same, you never crashed, at least in my experience, I've never crashed VoiceOver. It's just a fantastic overall experience. Tiger brought us the dashboard. It brought us Spotlight. It brought us iChat AV, which of course now is dead and is replaced by Apple Messages. But, excuse me, it really was the beginning for a lot of things that these days we take for granted, and it all started here with macOS 10 Tiger. Now, I mentioned earlier that I needed hardware to go with it. So I needed a notebook because I was taking my notes in class, obviously, and what we'd arranged was for my late father to take the Vio because he needed a new laptop, and so what would happen in exchange is he would get me what I'm about to show you here, which is an iBook G4 14-inch. This is a PowerPC G4. I honestly don't remember the specs of it. And of course, these days, being 15 years old, it wouldn't be of much use except beyond the basics. But I gave it to a friend of mine. And that friend of mine has since become a former friend. We had a bit of a falling out. But even if we didn't, I don't think I'd want this iBook back. And the reason for that is because of the system being old enough to where even modern-day security protocols, the operating system wouldn't be able to handle. But it's just a really interesting piece of history. This was my first Macintosh notebook, and what I loved about it was the fact that at the time, Windows PCs only had a couple hours, maybe 2-3 hours at best. That's why I couldn't use the Vio for 2 1.5-hour classes across the board, because that's 3 hours if you just let it sit idle. If you don't and you're actually using it, then a lot of Windows PCs just couldn't last 3 hours for a class. Whereas the iBook, 6 hours on a charge. Now, these days we take long battery life, relatively speaking, quote unquote long battery life, for granted on laptops. And with this new breed of Apple Silicon Macs, we're going to get even better battery life with Qualcomm Snapdragon on the PC side, also an ARM chip. We're going to get better battery life. But back in the day, when this was brand new, there was a real discrepancy between Mac and PC in terms of how much you could get out of a charge, and being able to take the iBook in and take notes on it for 2 classes back to back and never have to worry about bringing your charger, finding an outlet, plugging it in. That was fantastic. I loved my iBook. And then, so I kept the iBook for a couple of years, and then things switched again. After about 3 or 4 years, what ended up happening was Apple switched over to Intel, and they were bringing out OS X Leopard. And among other things, Leopard introduced something like a Time Machine. Here's Leopard. And it introduced things, like I said, like Time Machine, like cover flow, a lot of things that were just fantastic. Again, at the time, really new stuff. But my iBook, being a 3 or 4 year old system, would be able to run it, but I ran this by a YouTuber who actually worked for Apple at the time as a genius repairing the computers, and he recommended that it was time to upgrade. And so that's what we did. And so for my birthday of that particular year, I was a sophomore in college. I got a 2008 Apple MacBook, and that MacBook lasted me from Leopard through Snow Leopard, and it was just a fantastic little computer. The only problem that I remember having with it was this system had a white keyboard. In my experience, all my years as a Mac user, all the computers have been white. The eMac, the iMac, the iBook. So I wanted to keep that going. I wanted to keep the white. Unfortunately, I made a mistake because the keyboard yellowed, and I never had experience like that, anything like that before on a computer. But the keyboard had yellowed, the top case had cracked, and I actually had to get the hard drive replaced at least once. but the system itself was basically on its way out. So when it came time to upgrade again, we put on OS X Lion, but much like prior systems, it didn't run really well on the MacBook. So we upgraded to Lion, but I did need a new system, and right about the same time that my white MacBook came out, the first generation of the MacBook Air came out, and I had my eye on it for a time. But the price to capacity ratio, 64 gigs for $1,800, in my opinion, compared to what I was getting with the MacBook, was not a really good bargain, in my opinion. So later on, though, after the MacBook had served me for a couple of years, we ended up getting a second generation MacBook Air. And that system lasted me, honestly, for about 4 years. It lasted me through OS X, Yosemite, and then we ended up getting an iMac, and that took me all the way through to El Capitan. This is the second iMac that I've had. It is a 21-inch Core i5, but it's got a Fusion drive in it. This is the one I'm actually on right now that I'm recording this video on, for those of you who do not know. It's got a Fusion drive in it. It's 5 years old. It's starting to get a little long in the tooth. And guess what? It's not going to be able to run Big Sur. I mentioned that in a prior video. So for those of you who did see it, I apologize. But for those of you who did not see it, yes, it is no longer. The system is dead. The system is dead. It's usable, but it's on its way out. So OS X Big Sur will not be running on this system, but this will be the very last system to support macOS X, at least in my collection, and it's been a good run. It's been 18 years, right? It's been 18 years, and as far as looking ahead to the future, we got macOS Big Sur, which again is version 11. They are going to be running it on Apple Silicon going forward. Not immediately. It's going to be a 2-year transition, but the very first Apple Silicon-based Mac will be out by the end of the year. You know, keep your fingers crossed and hope. I'm actually thinking about getting one, and I know in the prior video I said I wasn't sure, but I've got something to show you. This folder up here, it's labeled Xcode. I've started teaching myself how to develop programs for the iPhone and, by extension, the iPad and these new Apple Silicon Macs. I've got something in the pipeline, but I want to keep that as a surprise, so I will be revealing that to you when the time comes. It won't be anytime soon. It's going to be a while. But there is something in the pipeline, and I am, like I said, learning how to develop for the iPhone, the iPad, and by extension, all future Macintoshes running Apple Silicon. One of the things that I love about the Mac is the way the desktop is organized. With the iPad, you've got a lot of flexibility, but you don't have near as much flexibility as you do on the Mac. It's getting closer, but at the same time, would I buy, like, in order to make the iPad close enough to the Mac, I've got a keyboard and a mouse, but having to set it up and put it away, I use it, but, especially for traveling, and a lot of people would say, well, why not just get the new keyboard cover? Well, the one thing I don't like about that, actually two things. Number one, it's $300, and I think that for a keyboard that's too steep. And number two, more importantly, there's no side protection for the iPad. When I got my iPad Pro, I got with it an OtterBox 360 case, and I do not intend to take that thing off. It is, to be honest, I'm afraid to take it off because of all the issues with the bending. Now, my iPad thankfully hasn't bent, but I'd really rather not take any chances. I'd rather have it protected because that iPad, I was intending on replacing this iMac with that iPad. Now, for a lot of things, it has happened to work, but Xcode is not yet available on the iPad, and I've been thinking about this. Even if it is, because of the smaller screen, you'd have a lot less space to work with, right? So, so I was thinking about the rumored, the first generation of Apple Silicon Macs, and supposedly it's going to be a 14-inch MacBook Pro. But more important than that, a lot of people are saying, well, why not just stick to Intel? I'm not going to do that, and I'll tell you why. Apps. I spend a lot more time on my iPhone these days for casual activities than anything. I've got way more apps on the iPhone than I do on the Mac. And one of the great side effects of this new silicon is the fact that Apple iPhone and iPad apps will be able to run on macOS Big Sur Apple Silicon without any modification. Now, how's that going to affect my workload? Well, let's take a look back once again down memory lane. When I first started in my graphic design journey, I was using Adobe Illustrator. Now, I tried Adobe Illustrator for the Mac, the current day version, and it brought back a lot of memories. It felt like riding a bike. Now, I didn't remember everything, but I remembered a lot. But there was a problem. Excuse me. Adobe's pricing strategy. They want you to pay $35 per month continuously. And if you stop paying, you could actually lose access to your workflow. I know. As much as I loved Illustrator, I really did not feel like ponying up the money because I'm just one person. And I think because of Adobe's dominance in the graphic design sector, I think that they've basically catered more towards big business that can afford these kind of licensing parameters. Me personally, I just don't think it's worth it. But going back to the business of Apple Silicon and iPad apps running on the Mac, there's actually something that could very easily almost replace it, except for the very high-end stuff, which, to be honest, I never really did in my high school classes. And also, it's been 15 years since I've really gotten into it deep, so I'm basically having to learn how to drive all over again. Like I said, I did remember a lot of things, but I didn't remember everything. A really nice fill-in for Adobe Illustrator, especially for the price, which is like $50 one time only, is Affinity Designer. It contains a lot of the stuff that I was used to from Illustrator, and as I said, a lot of people are making that switch just because of the pricing model. I think Adobe has. Now, again, if you're a big company and you can afford to swing it, of course, go with Adobe. If that's what you've been working with forever, then go with it because that's what you're used to. That's what your workers are used to. But in terms of being somebody who is individual, just doing this for fun, I don't think it's worth the price Adobe is asking. So that's why I decided to go to Designer. And Designer is available for the iPad, iPhone, and the Mac. And what's really cool is that I'll be able to effectively load Designer onto the new Silicon Mac without it being a problem. Most likely it'll be the iPad version, but we'll see. We'll see. Maybe Affinity's actually working on getting a Mac Silicon optimized version of Designer, and they've also got Photo, which is an alternative to Photoshop. Again, except for all but the high end, super high end, which I don't really participate in, because again, I haven't even touched Photoshop in 15 years. So you got Photo for Photoshop, and then Publisher for Adobe InDesign, and you got $150 for all three of these versus, I think, for Adobe back in the day when I was on Adobe Illustrator 10, it was several $1,000s just for one program, let alone three. So, I mean, which is more financially feasible, you know? And then, of course, during my graphic design days, I also worked on a bit of video production, and we used Final Cut Pro and Final Cut Express. Apple's already got Final Cut Pro running on Apple Silicon Macs, but I'll be honest, this is the Final Cut Pro that I'm used to, the old way of doing things. And they have since rewritten Final Cut Pro from the ground up, and it's not something that I'm honestly familiar with anymore. So as a result, I wanted something more familiar with the old Final Cut Pro and Final Cut Express. Enter LumaFusion, and a lot of people, a lot of video producers on YouTube especially, love LumaFusion, myself included. I mean, I edited a few videos on the Mac, or on the iPad, excuse me, and the fact that LumaFusion is going to run on Apple Silicon without modification, I mean, that's going to be awesome, because I tried looking for LumaFusion, hoping they ported it to the Mac, and they didn't. But now they won't need to worry about doing it so much because, again, of the Apple Silicon. And it's really interesting to see how far we've come. And it all started. So I'm really looking forward to the Apple Silicon, but it's really nice to see where it all started for me. And that was back with OS X Jaguar and this humble little eMac. For those of you that go that far back, do you guys remember the eMac? Do you remember OS X Jaguar? What was your favorite Mac from back in the early to mid 2000s? Thank you for watching. Comments are welcome, and have a nice day.